On a quiet summer night in Florida, a respected doctor returned home alone after leaving her family behind in Connecticut. She had no idea that someone was already waiting for her. The next morning, Teresa Sievers would be found dead inside her own home. At first, investigators had no idea who could have wanted this mother of two dead. Her husband, Mark Sievers, was more than 1,000 miles away with their daughters and appeared to have a perfect alibi. But then investigators discovered a rented blue Chevrolet Cruze that had traveled from Missouri to Florida. They recovered GPS data that someone had tried to erase. Then security cameras showed two men buying towels, rubber shoes, trash bags, and a lock-picking kit just hours before Teresa was killed. One of those men was Mark Sievers' childhood best friend, and the most disturbing part was that he looked remarkably similar to Mark. The deeper investigators looked, the more they realized this was not a random murder. Someone had planned Teresa Sievers' death long before the hammer was ever raised. Tell me where you are watching from, and if you are new to this channel, please subscribe for more real crime stories. Bonita Springs in Florida was known for quiet streets, peaceful neighborhoods, and families who believed they were living in one of the safest places imaginable. But on June 29, 2015, that sense of safety would be shattered inside a home that appeared completely ordinary from the outside. At the center of this case was Dr. Teresa Sievers. She was 46 years old. She was a respected holistic physician. She was a mother of two young daughters. She also owned restorative health and healing in Estero, where she had built a reputation for caring deeply about her patients. Teresa was known as intelligent, kind, and compassionate. People who visited her clinic often remembered the way she treated them with warmth and attention. To many people, she was more than a doctor. She was someone who genuinely wanted to improve the lives of the people around her. At home, Teresa lived with her husband, Mark Sievers, and their two daughters. Mark was involved in the family business and handled much of the financial and administrative side of the clinic, while Teresa focused on medicine and her patients. From the outside, the Sievers family looked successful. They had a respected doctor in the family. They had children. They had a business. They appeared to have built the kind of life many people dream about. But investigators would later discover that the picture seen from the outside was very different from what was happening behind closed doors. In late June of 2015, the family traveled to Connecticut to attend a family wedding and spend time with relatives. It was supposed to be a normal family trip, but Teresa had responsibilities waiting for her back in Florida. Her patients were expecting her at the clinic. She decided to return home before the rest of her family. Mark stayed behind in Connecticut with their daughters, while Teresa traveled back to Florida alone. On Sunday night, June 28th, Teresa arrived at Southwest Florida International Airport at around 9:30 in the evening. She was tired after the journey, but her plan was simple. She would return home, get some rest, then wake up the next morning and go back to work. She had no reason to believe that the next few hours would be the final hours of her life. Teresa used a ride service to travel from the airport to her home in Bonita Springs. Security cameras from a nearby property captured her arriving at the house. She walked toward the entrance carrying her luggage after the trip. Nothing about her movements suggested fear. She did not appear to know that danger was nearby. She simply walked into her home as she had done countless times before. Those few seconds recorded by a camera would later become one of the last known images of Teresa alive. Inside the house, another story was about to unfold. The following morning, Teresa was expected at her clinic. Her employees knew that she was extremely punctual. If something prevented her from coming to work, she normally contacted her staff. But that morning, Teresa never arrived. At first, the employees were concerned. Then they became increasingly worried when their calls went unanswered. They tried reaching her again and again, but there was no response. Something was clearly wrong. The staff eventually contacted Mark, who was still in Connecticut with the girls. Mark was informed that Teresa had not shown up for work and could not be reached. He asked a close family friend and neighbor named Dr. Mark Petrites to go to the house and check on her. At that moment, there were still innocent explanations. Perhaps Teresa had become sick after the flight. Perhaps she was exhausted and still sleeping. Perhaps there was a problem with her phone. But when Dr. Petrites arrived at the house around 9 in the morning, he would discover something no one was prepared to see. The house was strangely quiet. He entered and began calling Teresa. There was no answer. He moved through the rooms searching for her. Then he reached the kitchen. What he saw there immediately changed the case from a missing doctor to a homicide investigation. Teresa was lying dead on the kitchen floor. The scene showed that she had suffered a brutal attack. Emergency responders were called, but there was nothing they could do. Teresa was already dead. Investigators soon determined that she had suffered multiple blunt force injuries to the head. A hammer was found near the body. The weapon appeared to have been left behind after the attack. The violence immediately raised questions. Why would anyone want Teresa dead? Who could have entered the house? And most importantly, why would someone attack her with such force? At first, investigators had to consider the possibility of a home invasion. Some parts of the house appeared disturbed. Drawers looked as though they had been searched. Objects were out of place. It could have been staged to make the scene look like a robbery, but there were details that did not fit. A normal burglar usually wants to get in and get out as quickly as possible. The level of violence used against Teresa suggested something far more personal. Investigators began asking whether the killer had known Teresa. The question became even more important because there did not appear to be an obvious reason for a stranger to target her. Teresa was a doctor and a mother. She was respected in her community. There was no immediate explanation for why someone would travel to her home and kill her. Meanwhile, Mark was still in Connecticut. He was more than 1,000 miles away from the crime scene. He was surrounded by relatives and his daughters. On the surface, his location seemed to give him an almost perfect alibi, but investigators could not simply assume that the husband was innocent or guilty. They had to examine everything: his relationship with Teresa, his finances, his movements, his communications, and anyone who might have had a reason to hurt her. While detectives worked inside the home, another investigation was beginning outside. They started examining security footage from the neighborhood. Hours of recordings were reviewed. Every vehicle that appeared near the house became potentially important. Then investigators noticed something unusual. A blue Chevrolet Cruze had been seen near the Sievers home around the time of the murder. At first, a strange car in a neighborhood might mean nothing, but investigators decided to trace it. They discovered that the vehicle had been rented in Missouri. That immediately changed the importance of the car. Someone had traveled from another state to southwest Florida shortly before Teresa was killed. Investigators then examined the vehicle's GPS system. What they found was even more suspicious. Someone had attempted to erase the GPS information. It looked like an effort to hide the route the vehicle had taken. But deleting information does not always mean destroying it. Forensic specialists were able to recover part of the data. The recovered information helped investigators reconstruct the journey from Missouri toward Florida. The trail was becoming clearer. This was not simply a car that happened to be nearby. Someone had traveled a very long distance and arrived in Bonita Springs at almost exactly the time investigators needed to understand. Then the GPS trail pointed investigators toward another location, a Walmart near Teresa's home. Security footage from the store showed two men shopping before the murder. What they purchased would become one of the strangest pieces of evidence in the entire case. They bought black towels, rubber shoes, large trash bags, wet wipes, a lock-picking kit, a black backpack. Other items were also purchased. Individually, those products were ordinary. Together, they looked very different. They looked like supplies prepared for a specific purpose. The men paid with cash. There were no obvious bank card records connecting the purchase to them, but they had already left another trail behind. The cameras had captured their faces. The rental car had left digital information, and the GPS system had preserved part of their journey even after someone tried to erase it. Investigators now had a murder victim, a suspicious rented vehicle, two unidentified men, a trail leading from Missouri to Florida, and a shopping trip that appeared to have happened just hours before Teresa's death. But the biggest question was still unanswered. Who were these two men, and why had they come all the way to Florida? The answer would soon reveal a connection that made the case far more disturbing than a random home invasion, because one of the men was not a stranger at all. He was connected directly to Teresa's husband, and investigators were about to discover that this connection was much deeper than they could have imagined. The man investigators were about to identify was Curtis Wayne Wright, Jr. Wright was not a stranger to the Sievers family. He was Mark Sievers' childhood friend from Missouri. The two had known each other for years and remained close. But there was another detail that immediately caught investigators' attention. Wright looked remarkably similar to Mark. Their resemblance was strong enough that people could sometimes confuse them from a distance. Investigators now had a possible connection between the mysterious men and Teresa's husband. The second man was Jimmy Ray Rodgers. Unlike Wright, Rodgers had a criminal history and a record involving violent behavior. The investigation was moving quickly, but detectives still needed to prove what these men had actually done. Then a woman in Missouri came forward with information about Wright. She told investigators that Wright had disappeared during the same weekend Teresa was murdered. He claimed he was traveling to help someone with a technical problem, but before leaving, he made a strange decision. He left his personal phone behind. Investigators believed this could have been an attempt to avoid leaving a location trail. Wright initially denied being involved and claimed he had remained in Missouri, but the evidence was beginning to tell a different story. Recovered GPS data placed the rented vehicle on a journey from Missouri toward Florida. Wright had also created another unexpected digital trail during the trip. He had posted online reviews of restaurants he visited. Those records were connected to dates and locations and helped confirm his movements toward Florida. Investigators could now establish that Wright had been in Bonita Springs around the time Teresa was killed. They also discovered that the men had used another rented vehicle, a white Hyundai Elantra. Using rental cars instead of personal vehicles could reduce the chance of connecting the journey to their identities, but every attempt to avoid detection was creating another piece of evidence. Detectives then turned their attention toward Mark. They began examining his marriage and financial situation. The perfect family image started to crack. Investigators found reports of marital problems and conflicts involving money. There were also reports of possible infidelity. None of these details proved murder, but they gave investigators a reason to look deeper. Then they discovered something much more important. Mark was facing financial pressure. The family had a federal tax debt of more than $32,000. Teresa also had several life insurance policies worth millions of dollars. Reports placed the combined value at approximately $4.4 million. Suddenly, investigators had a possible motive. If Teresa died, a large amount of money could become available. There was another concern as well. Investigators believed Mark feared that Teresa might seek a divorce. A divorce could create financial consequences and a custody dispute involving their daughters. The picture was becoming disturbing. A husband facing financial pressure, a troubled marriage, multi-million-dollar insurance policies, a childhood friend who had traveled from Missouri, and two men caught buying suspicious supplies shortly before the murder. But investigators still needed to connect Mark directly to the alleged plan. According to prosecutors, Mark provided Wright with important information about Teresa's home. That information included access codes and the location of a hidden key. That information could explain why investigators found no obvious signs of a stranger forcing entry. The investigation also uncovered communications involving burner phones and the encrypted Signal application. Prosecutors argued that the men avoided directly discussing murder and instead used references connected to medical matters as coded language. Another important discovery involved the home security system. Investigators conclude that the alarm had been disabled before the attack. According to the prosecution's theory, Wright had been given information that allowed him to enter the house without triggering the system. The men allegedly entered before Teresa returned and waited for her. She had no idea anyone was inside. She believed she was simply coming home after a family trip. But the investigators were now seeing something very different. This was beginning to look less like a random attack and more like a carefully prepared operation. The rental vehicles had left records. The GPS data had survived an attempt to erase it. Walmart cameras had captured the suspects. Their purchases had created another trail. Wright had left digital evidence during the journey, and the connection between Wright and Mark was becoming harder to ignore. Yet one major question remained. Mark had been thousands of miles away in Connecticut when Teresa was killed. His alibi appeared almost perfect. If investigators wanted to prove he was involved, they needed more than suspicion. They needed evidence that could show what happened behind the scenes. And after Teresa's funeral, they discovered that someone had tried to destroy exactly that kind of evidence. But the investigators were about to recover something that was never supposed to be found. After Teresa's funeral, investigators turned their attention to the electronic devices connected to Mark. According to the investigation, several devices had been discarded, including hard drives and mobile phones. The goal appeared obvious. If those devices contained conversations or planning connected to the murder, then destroying them could make the evidence disappear. But digital evidence can survive in places people never expect. Specialists from the Lee County Sheriff's Office worked with federal investigators and recovered data that Mark may have believed was gone forever. Among the recovered material were digital writings connected to his marriage and his feelings toward Teresa. According to prosecutors, those writings showed resentment toward his wife and frustration with the relationship. They also contained information about his unhappiness and his interest in other women. For the prosecution, these records helped reveal a side of the marriage that was very different from the happy family image people had seen. But the investigators still needed something much stronger than evidence of marital problems. A difficult marriage could explain tension, financial pressure could explain stress, but neither could prove that Mark had arranged a murder. Then the investigation reached the man who could potentially connect everything together. Curtis Wayne Wright Jr. agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. In 2016, Wright pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received a 25-year sentence. In exchange, he agreed to tell investigators what he knew about the planning and execution of Teresa murder. His decision became a major turning point. Wright claimed that Mark had spoken to him about serious problems in his marriage. According to Wright, Mark had discussed financial pressure and fears about what could happen if Teresa decided to leave him. He allegedly worried about losing access to money and facing a custody dispute involving the children. Wright claimed that the conversation eventually became much darker. According to his testimony, Mark offered him money to travel from Missouri to Florida and kill Teresa. Wright accepted the plan but decided that he needed another person. He recruited Ray Rodgers. The two men then began preparing for the journey. They rented vehicles, they bought supplies with cash, they traveled across several states, and according to Wright, they received information that helped them enter Teresa's home. Prosecutors said Mark had provided details about access codes and the location of a hidden key. That information became important because investigators had already noticed that the scene did not look like a normal forced entry. The house could be entered without a dramatic break-in. Teresa could be attacked inside her own home. Then the scene could be disturbed to make the murder appear random. But the plan had already left too many traces. The rented Chevrolet Cruze had traveled from Missouri. The GPS data had survived an attempt to erase it. Walmart cameras had captured Wright and Rodgers buying suspicious supplies. Wright had left digital evidence along the journey, and Rodgers had allegedly made another mistake after returning from Florida. According to investigators, he told his girlfriend about his involvement and asked her to dispose of clothing connected to the murder. Instead, she contacted authorities. She led investigators to the location where the clothing had been discarded. The recovered items became important physical evidence against Rodgers. Now the case had multiple layers. There was digital evidence, there was physical evidence, there was surveillance footage, there was the rental vehicle trail, and there was Wright's testimony. But the defense would later argue that this still did not prove Mark had ordered the murder. His attorneys maintained that Wright and Rodgers could have acted independently. They pointed out that Mark was not physically present in Florida when Teresa was killed. He was in Connecticut with his daughters and relatives. His alibi remained one of the biggest challenges for the prosecution. Investigators therefore had to show that physical distance did not mean innocence. They argued that Mark had created the perfect situation for himself. He could remain thousands of miles away while other people carried out the attack. Then came another major courtroom development. In October 2019, Ray Rodgers went on trial. Prosecutors presented evidence linking him to the murder and conspiracy. His former girlfriend became an important witness because she had told investigators about his alleged confession and helped them recover the discarded clothing. The jury did not convict Rodgers of first-degree murder as prosecutors had requested. Instead, he was found guilty of second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. With Rodgers convicted and Wright cooperating with authorities, the attention now turned completely toward Mark. The prosecution believed it had enough evidence to tell the jury a complete story. A husband facing financial and marital problems, a childhood friend who traveled from Missouri, a second man with a violent history, rental vehicles, suspicious purchases, recovered digital evidence, and a witness who claimed Mark had personally arranged the killing. But the final question remained. Would a jury believe that story, or would they believe that Wright and Rodgers had created the entire plan themselves? In December 2019, Mark Sievers finally entered the courtroom to face the evidence that investigators had spent years collecting. The prosecution now had one central task. They had to convince the jury that Mark was not simply a husband who happened to be far away when his wife was murdered. They had to prove that he was the person behind the plan. Curtis Wayne Wright became the most important witness in that effort. Wright had already admitted his own role and had accepted a 25-year prison sentence through his agreement with prosecutors. Now he stood before the jury and described what he said had happened between himself and Mark before the murder. According to Wright, Mark had wanted Teresa dead. The defense attacked Wright's credibility and argued that he had every reason to shift blame toward Mark. His testimony was therefore only one part of a much larger case. Prosecutors presented the digital evidence and the physical evidence as pieces of the same story. They argued that the journey from Missouri to Florida was not accidental. They argued that the purchases made before the murder were not ordinary shopping. They argued that the communication between the people involved showed preparation. And they argued that the information about Teresa home could only have come from someone close to her. The defense presented a very different picture. Mark had not been at the house. He had been in Connecticut with family. There was no direct physical evidence showing that he had personally attacked Teresa. His attorneys argued that Wright and Rodgers could have acted independently, and that Wright's testimony was unreliable because he had received a reduced sentence for cooperating with the state. The jury therefore had to look at the entire chain of evidence. Could all these separate details really be connected without Mark? Or did they make sense only when viewed as parts of a murder-for-hire conspiracy? During the trial, the prosecution also focused on the possible motive. Teresa had been carrying several life insurance policies worth millions of dollars. Mark was dealing with financial pressure. Their marriage had reportedly been troubled, and investigators believed Mark feared what could happen if Teresa decided to divorce him. Prosecutors argued that these circumstances gave him a reason to want Teresa gone. But motive alone was not enough. The jury needed to believe that Mark had actually taken steps to turn that motive into a plan. That was where Wright's testimony became so important. According to Wright, Mark had allegedly provided details about the house and access information that helped the killers enter the property. The prosecution argued that this explained why the murder scene did not look like a genuine random burglary. It also supported the theory that Teresa had been deliberately targeted. After weeks of testimony, the case finally reached its decisive moment. The jury deliberated over the evidence and eventually returned its verdict. Mark Sievers was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The verdict meant that the jury accepted the prosecution theory that Mark had been involved in planning the killing of his wife. But the case was not finished. The next question was whether Mark would receive the ultimate punishment. During the penalty phase, Teresa's mother, Marianne Groves, spoke to the court. She described Teresa as a loving daughter and mother, and a woman who dedicated her life to helping others. She also spoke directly about the devastation caused by Teresa's death. Her words reflected the pain of losing a daughter and watching two children grow up without their mother. The jury recommended death. On January 3, 2020, Judge Bruce Kyle sentenced Mark Sievers to death. He was sent to Union Correctional Institution in Florida, where he remains on death row. For Teresa family, the conviction brought a measure of accountability, but it could never undo what happened. The legal battle also did not end with the sentence. In November 2022, the Florida Supreme Court affirmed Mark's conviction and death sentence.